It was the afternoon of June 19, 2010. In the small rural village of Anco, life moved quietly, almost predictably. The narrow dirt roads were lined with simple brick houses. Farmers worked in nearby fields. Elderly villagers sat outside their homes, chatting while watching the occasional motorcycle pass by. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. But inside one modest house near the edge of the village, something terrible had already happened. Around 4:30 p.m., an elderly woman named Lou walked slowly toward the home of her son. She often stopped by in the afternoons to check on her daughter-in-law and her young grandson. As she approached the house, she noticed something strange. The front door was slightly open. Inside, the house was silent. Not the normal quiet of an empty home, but a heavy, unsettling silence. She stepped through the doorway and called out. No one answered. Her grandson, 9-year-old Wang Jian, should have been home from school soon. Her daughter-in-law, Yen Sujuan, was usually inside preparing dinner. But there was no sound from the kitchen, no television, no footsteps, only silence. Feeling uneasy, the old woman slowly walked toward the bedroom. When she pushed the door open, the scene in front of her was something no mother-in-law could ever imagine. Yen Sujuan was lying on the floor. Her body was motionless, twisted awkwardly beside the bed. Dark stains had spread across the wooden floor. For a few seconds, the old woman couldn't move. Her mind refused to accept what her eyes were seeing. Then the reality struck. She began screaming. Neighbors rushed toward the house after hearing her cries. But when they entered, they quickly realized the nightmare was far worse than anyone expected. In the living room, near the sofa, they found another body. It was Wang Jian. The 9-year-old boy had just returned home from school earlier that afternoon. He never had the chance to escape. Panic spread through the small village as more people gathered outside the house. Within minutes, the quiet afternoon had turned into chaos. Someone called the police. When investigators arrived, they immediately sealed off the home with yellow tape. Officers began examining every corner of the crime scene. But the case quickly became deeply puzzling. There were no signs of forced entry. Nothing valuable appeared to be missing. And perhaps the most disturbing detail of all, several neighbors had been sitting outside their homes all afternoon. Yet no one heard a scream, no one heard a struggle, and no one saw a stranger entering or leaving the house. It was as if the killer had come and gone without making a sound. But hidden within that silent house were clues. Clues that would soon reveal a story far darker than anyone in the village could have imagined. Because this wasn't a random crime, and the person responsible was someone who already knew the family very well. Before investigators could find the killer, they first needed to understand the people whose lives had been taken. In a quiet village like Anco, everyone knew everyone. News traveled fast, and within hours, police had begun learning more about the family at the center of the tragedy. The woman found in the bedroom was Yen Sujuan, a 36-year-old mother. By most accounts, she lived a simple life. She helped manage the household while her husband worked long hours outside the home. Neighbors described her as quiet and hardworking. She rarely argued with anyone and was known for keeping the home tidy and organized. Nothing about her suggested she had enemies. Her son, Wang Jian, was only 9 years old. Teachers at the local school described him as energetic and polite. He loved playing with friends in the village after class and was known to ride his small bicycle through the narrow dirt roads near his home. On the day of the murders, he had simply returned from school like he did every afternoon. But this ordinary routine would lead him directly into a horrifying scene. The boy likely walked into the house expecting to see his mother. Instead, investigators believed he may have discovered something no child should ever witness. And moments later, his life was taken as well. The father of the family, Wang Qing, was not home when the murders occurred. He owned a small woodworking business in the village and often spent long hours at his workshop. When police notified him about the deaths, he rushed home and collapsed in shock. Witnesses later described him as completely devastated. At first glance, the family appeared to live an ordinary life. They were not wealthy, but they were stable. They had a home, a small business, and no known criminal connections, which made the murders even more confusing. Why would someone target this family? Investigators began asking the obvious questions. Was this a robbery that went wrong? A personal grudge? Or something more complicated hidden beneath the surface of their seemingly quiet life? As detectives spoke with villagers, another detail began to emerge. Although the family seemed normal on the outside, the husband, Wang Qing, had developed a very close friendship with a man named Qi Lingtuan. The two men worked together and often spent time drinking or talking after work. At first, it appeared to be nothing more than an ordinary friendship. But as investigators continued digging deeper into the relationships surrounding the family, they began to uncover a secret that would completely change the direction of the case. A secret involving betrayal, obsession, and a disturbing psychological dynamic that few people in the village could have ever imagined. And once this secret surfaced, the investigation would take a much darker turn. As the investigation began, detectives focused on the most obvious question: who could have entered the house without being noticed? The crime scene suggested something unusual. There were no signs of forced entry. The door was not broken. Windows were intact. Nothing appeared to have been stolen. To investigators, this pointed to a strong possibility. The victims may have known the person who entered the house. In small villages like Anco, doors were often left unlocked during the day. Neighbors visited each other freely. A familiar face could easily walk in without raising suspicion. Police began interviewing everyone connected to the family: relatives, neighbors, friends, and anyone who had visited the house in recent days. Soon, the investigation produced its first potential suspect: a 17-year-old boy named Lu Zhenxian. During the forensic examination of the bedroom, investigators discovered fingerprints inside a wardrobe belonging to the victim. Those prints matched Lu. For a moment, detectives believed they had found their killer. But when the teenager was brought in for questioning, the story quickly became more complicated. Under pressure, Lu admitted something unexpected. 2 days before the murders, he had secretly entered the house to steal money. The family had recently paid workers for a construction job, and Lu believed cash might still be inside the home. He had opened the wardrobe while searching for it. But according to his statement, he never found anything valuable and left shortly afterward. Most importantly, Lu insisted he had nothing to do with the murders. Police initially suspected he was lying, but when they examined his timeline on the day of the crime, the evidence told a different story. At the time investigators believed the murders occurred, around 5 p.m., Lu was participating in a school athletic competition. Teachers, classmates, and event records all confirmed it. His alibi was solid. Reluctantly, investigators were forced to eliminate him as a suspect. The case returned to square one. With the teenage burglar ruled out, detectives turned their attention to another possible motive: family conflict. Some villagers mentioned that the family had previously been involved in a land dispute with relatives. In rural communities, arguments over property could escalate into serious feuds. One relative in particular, a man named Wang Jin, had reportedly argued with the family years earlier. Investigators quickly located him, but once again the lead collapsed. At the time of the murders, Wang Jin was working in Beijing, hundreds of kilometers away. Travel records and witnesses confirmed he had not returned to the village. Another suspect eliminated. Days passed, and the investigation seemed to be going nowhere. But then detectives began paying closer attention to someone they had almost overlooked. The one person closest to the victims, the husband, Wang Qing. At first, he appeared to be nothing more than a grieving husband and father. But as detectives continued speaking with him, they began noticing something strange. When they asked about his friends and relationships, Wang Qing repeatedly mentioned one name: Qi Lingtuan. His voice would tremble. Sometimes he would start to say something, then suddenly stop. It was as if he was hiding something, or perhaps he was afraid to say it out loud. Eventually, after several days of questioning, Wang Qing finally broke down, and what he revealed would shock the investigators. because the story he told was far stranger and far darker than anyone had expected. For several days, investigators kept returning to one question. Why did Wang Qing seem so uneasy whenever the name Qi Lingtuan came up? They worked together, drank together, and often spent time at each other's homes. But something about the way he spoke felt wrong. His answers were hesitant. Sometimes he would stop mid-sentence, as if he had nearly said too much. Detectives began to suspect that the truth about this friendship was far more complicated. During one late-night interview, the pressure finally became too much. Wang Qing broke down. Through tears and long pauses, he began to reveal a secret that no one in the village knew. He had been having an affair, not with a stranger, but with Qi Lingtuan's wife. The revelation stunned the investigators. Suddenly, the relationship between the two men looked very different. According to Wang Qing, the affair had started quietly. First, it was hidden. The two met in secret whenever Qi Lingtuan was away working. But eventually, Qi discovered the truth. Under normal circumstances, that kind of betrayal could lead to violence immediately. But what happened next was far stranger. Instead of ending the marriage or confronting Wang Qing directly, Qi Lingtuan reacted in a way that investigators struggled to understand. At first, he beat his wife in anger. But after the initial rage faded, his behavior began to change. Slowly, his reactions became disturbing. Qi didn't stop the relationship. In fact, he allowed it to continue. According to Wang Qing's confession, Qi even demanded something unthinkable. If they were going to continue the affair, it had to happen inside his own house. At the beginning, Qi would stay outside the room. Then, over time, he began standing near the door. Eventually, he would enter the room and watch. Investigators listening to Wang Qing's statement struggled to comprehend what they were hearing. The situation had evolved into something deeply twisted, a disturbing psychological dynamic that blurred the boundaries of humiliation, control, and obsession. And according to Wang Qing, it didn't stop there. Over time, Qi Lingtuan's behavior became even more extreme. The man who had once been betrayed by his friend had now become part of the very situation that destroyed his marriage. What began as anger had transformed into something darker, something obsessive. But this disturbing arrangement didn't last forever. Eventually, Wang Qing said he couldn't handle it anymore. The situation made him feel increasingly uncomfortable and frightened. He decided to end the relationship. He confessed everything to his own wife and cut off contact with Qi and his wife completely. He even gave them money and dismissed them from working at his woodworking shop. To Wang Qing, this was the end of the story. But for Qi Lingtuan, it was only the beginning. Because in the months that followed, investigators would later discover that something inside Qi had changed. The humiliation, the obsession, the loss of control, all of it began to build into something dangerous. And by the afternoon of June 19th, that dangerous obsession would finally explode into violence. Once investigators began focusing on Qi Lingtuan, the case that had seemed confusing for days suddenly started to make sense. The strange behavior of Wang Qing, the secret affair, and the disturbing relationship between the three adults all pointed toward one person who might have had both motive and opportunity. But suspicion alone was not enough. Police needed evidence. Detectives soon obtained permission to search the area around Qi Lingtuan's house. Officers carefully examined the yard, nearby storage areas, and the surrounding ground. During the search, they noticed a small patch of soil that looked recently disturbed. When they dug into the ground, they uncovered a shirt wrapped tightly in plastic. The shirt was heavily stained with dried blood. It was immediately sent for forensic testing. The results came back quickly, and they were devastating. The blood on the shirt matched the DNA of Yan Sujuan and her son Wang Jian. Faced with the evidence, Qi Lingtuan could no longer deny his involvement. During interrogation, he finally confessed to what had happened on the afternoon of June 19, 2010. According to his statement, the plan had originally been very different. He had not gone to the house intending to kill Yan Sujuan or the child. His real target was Wang Qing. For months, Qi had been overwhelmed by humiliation and anger. The twisted relationship involving his wife had left him feeling powerless and deeply ashamed. When Wang Qing finally ended the relationship and pushed him out of his life completely, that humiliation turned into resentment. In Qi's mind, Wang Qing had taken everything from him: his pride, his marriage, and the strange psychological control he had developed over the situation. Eventually, the anger turned into a plan. On the afternoon of the murders, Qi Lingtuan climbed over the wall and entered Wang Qing's home, believing he would find him there. But Wang Qing was still working at his woodworking shop. Inside the house was only Yan Sujuan. According to Qi, the two began arguing almost immediately. The confrontation quickly escalated into violence inside the bedroom. During the struggle, Yan Sujuan was fatally attacked. But the situation took an even darker turn shortly afterward. While Qi was still inside the house, the front door suddenly opened. 9-year-old Wang Jian had returned home from school. The boy walked inside and saw the horrifying scene. At that moment, Qi realized the child had become a witness. Panicking and afraid that the boy would reveal his identity, Qi chased him into the living room. Moments later, the second killing occurred. Afterward, Qi fled the house by climbing back over the wall. Later that night, he buried his blood-stained shirt behind his home, believing it would erase the evidence. But the shirt would ultimately lead police straight to him. During the interrogation, investigators were disturbed by Qi Lingtuan's behavior. At times, he showed little emotion when describing what had happened, as if the events had already become distant in his mind. What had begun as anger over betrayal had slowly evolved into something much darker. And in the end, 2 innocent lives had been lost because of it. With Qi Lingtuan's confession, the mystery that had shaken the small village of Anco was finally solved. What had once seemed like an impossible crime, 2 murders committed in a quiet home without witnesses, was now understood as the result of a deeply twisted personal conflict. The case moved quickly to court. Prosecutors presented the key evidence: the bloodstained shirt buried behind Qi Lingtuan's home, his confession during interrogation, the detailed timeline of the crime testimony about the disturbing relationship between Qi, his wife, and Wang Qing. Together, the evidence painted a clear picture of a man whose humiliation and obsession had slowly transformed into violence. The court ultimately found Qi Lingtuan guilty of intentional homicide. Because the crime involved 2 victims, including a child, the punishment was severe. He was sentenced to death. For the villagers of Anco, the case left behind a deep sense of shock. Many people struggled to understand how a man they had known for years could commit such a brutal crime. But for Wang Qing, the consequences were even more devastating. Although he was not responsible for the murders, his actions had indirectly set the chain of events into motion. The secret affair and the disturbing relationship that followed had played a crucial role in the tragedy. After the trial ended, Wang Qing reportedly sold his woodworking business. Soon afterward, he left the village with his elderly mother. He never returned. The house where the crime occurred eventually stood empty, a silent reminder of the events that had once shaken the entire community. Even years later, villagers still remembered that afternoon in June when police cars filled the narrow roads and the quiet village was suddenly at the center of a horrifying investigation. The case also raised uncomfortable questions about human psychology. How could humiliation turn into obsession? How could a relationship built on betrayal evolve into something so disturbing that it eventually led to murder? And perhaps the most troubling question of all, if the events between the 3 adults had been confronted earlier, if someone had stepped away before the situation spiraled out of control, could the tragedy have been avoided? Those questions remain difficult to answer. But one thing is certain: what happened in that quiet village was not just a story about crime. It was a story about how hidden emotions, shame, anger, obsession, can grow silently in the shadows until one day they explode with irreversible consequences.
Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more videos.